There is a place on Earth where the nearest humans may not be on Earth at all. Not on an island, not on a ship, not even on the same surface of the planet. They might be astronauts, flying 400 kilometers above you on the International Space Station. This place sits in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean, thousands of kilometers from the nearest land, surrounded by nothing but water, wind, and a disturbing amount of emptiness. It is called Point Nemo, the Oceanic Pole of Inaccessibility, the loneliest place on Earth. And somehow, humanity looked at the most isolated patch of ocean on the planet and said, "Perfect. Let's crash spaceships there." Because hidden beneath these waters is a graveyard, not of ships, not of submarines, but of spacecraft, Russian cargo vehicles, European space freighters, pieces of old orbital machines, and one day, possibly the International Space Station itself. Welcome to Point Nemo, the place so far from civilization, it became the final resting place of the space age. Point Nemo was not discovered by an explorer. No sailor landed there. No ancient map marked it. No dramatic expedition planted a flag and said, "Finally, we found absolutely nothing." Instead, Point Nemo was calculated. In 1992, Croatian survey engineer Hrvoje Lukatela used a geospatial computer program to find the exact point in the ocean farthest from any land. The answer was a spot in the South Pacific at approximately 48 degrees, 52.6 minutes south, 123 degrees, 23.6 minutes west, about 688 kilometers from the nearest land in multiple directions. That distance is hard to feel on a map because maps make oceans look smaller than they are. So think of it this way. 688 kilometers is roughly the distance from London to Cairo or from Los Angeles to Chicago. Except instead of cities, highways, airports, and coffee chains, you get water. A lot of water. The three nearest bits of land are tiny and almost comically unhelpful. To the north is Ducie Island, an uninhabited atoll in the Pitcairn Islands. To the northeast is Motu Nui, a small rocky islet near Easter Island. To the south is Maher Island, a frozen speck off Antarctica. None of these are exactly convenient places to borrow sugar from, and the nearest permanently inhabited land is much farther away. That is why Point Nemo has one of the strangest facts in geography. If you were floating there on a boat, the nearest living humans might be astronauts aboard the International Space Station as it passes overhead. The ISS orbits about 400 kilometers above Earth, far closer than the nearest people on land. That means Point Nemo is one of the few places where space can feel closer than civilization. The name fits perfectly. Nemo means nobody in Latin. It is also a reference to Captain Nemo from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the fictional submariner who wanted to escape the human world. Point Nemo is basically the planet saying, "Great choice, no neighbors, no traffic, no Wi-Fi, terrible delivery options." But Point Nemo is not just remote. It is also empty in another way. It sits inside the South Pacific Gyre, one of the largest rotating current systems on Earth. These currents help isolate the region from nutrient-rich coastal waters. And in the ocean, nutrients are everything. Nutrients feed plankton. Plankton feed small fish. Small fish feed bigger fish. Bigger fish attract birds, whales, and predators, remove the nutrients, and the whole food chain gets very quiet. That does not mean the water is completely lifeless. The ocean is never truly empty. But compared with richer coastal zones, this region is sparse, a kind of marine desert. Few ships pass through. There are no nearby islands packed with nesting seabirds. Large surface feeding activity is limited. It is one of the most isolated and least biologically busy parts of the ocean, which, for most people, sounds like a terrible vacation destination. For space agencies, it sounds like a safety feature, because when a spacecraft reaches the end of its life, it has to go somewhere. You cannot leave everything in orbit forever. Space debris is already a serious problem. Dead satellites, spent rocket stages, broken fragments, all moving at speeds fast enough to ruin someone's day in a very expensive way. And you cannot just let a large spacecraft fall randomly back to Earth. Most of it burns up during re-entry, but not always all of it. Big pieces can survive. And if those pieces land over a city, a farm, a highway, or basically anywhere people exist, that becomes a problem. So engineers aim for the emptiest place they can find. The broader remote region around Point Nemo is used as part of what is often called the Spacecraft Cemetery, a controlled re-entry zone in the South Pacific where spacecraft can be guided down with minimal risk to humans. Since the 1970s, hundreds of spacecraft and spacecraft components have been directed into this remote part of the Pacific. That includes Russian Progress cargo vehicles, European automated transfer vehicles, Japanese HTV cargo craft, and other orbital hardware. Most cemeteries have flowers. This one has titanium fragments and dead space trucks. One of the most famous objects sent into the South Pacific was Mir, the Russian space station. In 2001, after 15 years in orbit, Mir was deliberately deorbited. It broke apart during re-entry, with surviving debris falling into a remote region of the Pacific. And the biggest controlled deorbit is still ahead. NASA's transition plan for the International Space Station calls for a responsible, controlled, targeted deorbit into a remote ocean area after the station's operational life. NASA has also selected SpaceX to develop the U.S. deorbit vehicle that will help guide the ISS safely out of orbit and avoid risk to populated areas. The ISS is enormous, roughly the size of a football field, assembled over decades, and one of the most complex machines humanity has ever built. And one day, after hosting astronauts, experiments, spacewalks, repairs, emergencies, international cooperation, and probably a lot of very carefully labeled floating snacks, it will be brought down, not randomly, not dramatically crashing into a city like a disaster movie, but guided into the most remote ocean on Earth. The machine that helped humanity live in space may end its life in the place on Earth farthest from almost everyone. That is the strange logic of Point Nemo. It is useful because it is empty. Of course, when you have a place this isolated, people start attaching mysteries to it. And Point Nemo has one of the internet's favorite ocean mysteries, the Bloop. In 1997, underwater microphones operated by NOAA detected an ultra-low frequency sound in the Pacific Ocean. It was loud, it was strange, and it traveled across a huge distance underwater. Scientists called it the Bloop, which, honestly, is a very unserious name for something that made half the internet. Imagine a sea monster the size of a shopping mall. For years, the Bloop became a legend. Some people wondered if it came from an unknown animal. Others imagined a giant squid, and because the sound came from the remote South Pacific, near the general region of Point Nemo, the story got even better. A mysterious sound, the loneliest ocean, a place named Nobody. At that point, the internet did what the internet does best. It made everything worse and more exciting. But the real answer was not a monster. it was ice. Noah explains that the bloop was the sound of an icequake, an iceberg cracking and breaking away from an Antarctic glacier. The sound was powerful enough to travel thousands of kilometers through the ocean and be detected by hydrophones far away. So no, it was not Cthulhu clearing his throat, sadly. But the real explanation is still incredible. A frozen continent fractured. The ocean carried the sound. And microphones in one of the quietest regions of the planet heard it. That is what makes Point Nemo so fascinating. Its silence makes distant things feel closer. In the rest of the world's oceans, there is constant noise. Ships, engines, sonar, drilling, storms, cables, ports, trade routes, human activity. But around Point Nemo, the soundscape is different. Here, some of the loudest events may come not from humans, but from ice, wind, waves, and the deep mechanical groaning of the planet itself. Point Nemo is not just remote on a map. It is remote in sound, a listening room at the edge of the world. Point Nemo is part of a larger idea called a pole of inaccessibility. A pole of inaccessibility is not the highest point, the lowest point, or the most dramatic point. It is the hardest point to reach, the place farthest from access. There is a northern pole of inaccessibility in the Arctic, a southern one in Antarctica, a continental pole of inaccessibility deep in Central Asia. And then there is Point Nemo, the oceanic version. But Point Nemo feels different because it is in the ocean. We usually think of the ocean as a connector. Ships cross it, cables run beneath it, whales migrate through it, weather systems move across it, empires, trade routes, and global supply chains have all depended on it. The ocean is supposed to connect the world, but Point Nemo is where the network thins out. No major shipping lane needs it. No city depends on it. No island community lives beside it. No tourist brochure is begging you to visit. It is a blank spot in the system. And yet, that blankness has become useful. For most of human history, no one needed to know the exact location of Point Nemo. It was not a port. It was not a colony. It was not a trade route. It was not a battlefield. It was discovered not by arriving there, but by calculating where there must be. That is a very modern kind of discovery, a place found by math before most people ever imagined standing on it. And once we found it, we gave it a job. Not fishing, not shipping, not settlement, not tourism. Disposal. A graveyard for machines that once circled the planet. There is something strange and almost poetic about that. The emptiest place on Earth became useful because of the most advanced machines humans have ever made. Point Nemo reminds us that even in the 21st century, with satellites, GPS, global shipping, submarine cables, weather models, and maps in every pocket, Earth still has places that are not really part of our daily world. Places that resist us simply by being far away. No walls, no guards, no borders. Just distance, a terrifying amount of distance. And maybe that is why Point Nemo feels so powerful. It is not dangerous because something is there. It is haunting because almost nothing is. So, the next time you look at a map of the world, find the South Pacific. Then, look for the biggest, emptiest patch of blue you can find. Somewhere in that ocean is a point named Nobody. A point where the nearest humans may be astronauts. A point where spacecraft are guided down to die. A point where the ocean is so quiet that the cracking of Antarctic ice can become a global mystery. Point Nemo is the edge of the human world. Not because it is impossible to reach, but because almost no one has a reason to go there. And if you ever do find yourself there, floating in the middle of that endless blue. Remember, you are not just far from land. You are standing on the planet's silence, and beneath you, 4 kilometers down, may be the remains of machines that once touched space. If you like strange maps, hidden systems, and places that make Earth feel bigger than it should, subscribe to Global Facts. And tell me in the comments, what is the most remote place you have ever been? Because, unless it involved astronauts being your nearest neighbors, Point Nemo probably wins.